the hidden pain of emotional invisibility, and the lifelong conditioning to earn love by disappearing. At the core of the silently neglected child is not loud abuse, but the wound of not being felt, not being mirrored, not being emotionally met. The deepest imprint becomes this: my needs don't matter. My presence is a burden. Love must be earned by not needing. Part 1. High Impact Hook and Core Paradox. There is a very specific kind of loneliness, the kind that doesn't come from being alone, but from being unseen. Not abandoned, not rejected, just emotionally missed. It often begins quietly. A room, a childhood home, the hum of a fan, the sound of a television in the background, adults moving, talking, surviving, and you learning to shrink your emotional volume, learning not to interrupt, learning not to need. You weren't hit, you weren't screamed at, you were simply not held where it mattered. So you adapted. You became easy, low maintenance, mature for your age, self-sufficient, invisible. And somewhere along the way, you internalized a dangerous belief. If I don't take up space, I won't lose connection. You learned to disappear emotionally to stay relationally safe. And maybe no one ever told you this, but emotional neglect doesn't bruise the skin, it bruises the self. It teaches the nervous system that attachment is unreliable, that your inner world is a private burden, that comfort is something you give, not something you receive. Here is the core paradox. The very pattern that protected you as a child is now the pattern quietly starving you as an adult, because what once kept you included now keeps you unseen. And if any part of you is reacting right now, with tightness in the chest, a hollow familiarity, a quiet, "this feels like me," this video is not here to label you. It is here to witness what never was. Part 2. Definition and Psychological Authority. Silent emotional neglect is not what happened, it is what didn't. No consistent emotional attunement, no one tracking your internal weather, no one teaching you that feelings are safe to express and safe to receive. Psychologically, this creates what many clinicians call an emotional neglect schema, a deep unconscious blueprint that says, my inner world is unimportant, my needs overwhelm people, closeness requires self-erasure. Over time, the child doesn't protest, they adapt. And adaptation rewires the nervous system. Let's ground this in real psychology. First, avoidant attachment. When emotional comfort is inconsistent or unavailable, the child's nervous system learns not to seek, not to reach, not to depend. The attachment system doesn't shut down, it goes quiet. The child becomes internally independent, but relationally disconnected. Second, hypervigilance. When emotional presence is unreliable, the child starts scanning, tracking moods, monitoring atmospheres, reading micro-expressions. They become experts of the external and strangers to the internal. Safety is found not in being held, but in being accurate. Third, parentification. Many silently neglected children were not overtly abused, but they were subtly reversed. They became emotional regulators, peacekeepers, the strong one, the one who didn't add weight. This forces premature self-abandonment, and neurologically, this reshapes the brain's default mode network, the system responsible for identity, memory, and self-reference. Instead of developing around, what do I feel? What do I need? Who am I becoming? It organizes around what's required of me,
what keeps connection, what prevents disruption. The child becomes a psychological satellite, orbiting others, never landing in themselves. This is not a personality. This is a survival architecture. Part 3. Emotional cost and philosophical weight. There is a grief that has no funeral. A grief for the conversations that never happened, the comfort that never arrived, the version of you that never got to unfold. Carl Jung once wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." But another burden is quieter, the unlived emotional life of the child. Because when you are silently neglected, you don't lose people, you lose access. Access to your anger, access to your softness, access to your spontaneous becoming. You learn to be digestible, palatable, low noise, high functioning. And the cost? You sacrifice authenticity for acceptance, again and again and again. The core fear beneath this archetype is not rejection, it is emotional abandonment. The terror is not being disliked, it is being emotionally alone while in relationship. So even rest becomes complicated, even joy feels unsafe, even receiving feels like debt. You might notice this strange internal tension. You long to be known, but feel exposed when you are. You crave intimacy, but tense inside it. You want support, but don't know how to metabolize it. This is invisible grief. Grief for a childhood where no one mirrored your inner reality back to you and said, "Yes, that makes sense. Yes, you matter. Yes, I am here." So the adult walks the world, appearing stable, appearing capable, appearing unaffected, while privately carrying a quiet orphanage, not of parents, but of being emotionally parented. Part 4. Adult manifestation and the unlearning process. Silently neglected children do not grow up to feel broken. They grow up to feel unclear. Unclear needs, unclear limits, unclear longings. The past doesn't repeat as memory, it repeats as identity. You might recognize yourself here. Relationships. You might overfunction, attract emotionally unavailable partners, feel safest when you are needed, not when you are cherished. You may struggle to receive without guilt, to express needs without rehearsing, to believe care without proof. Career. You might become indispensable, the reliable one, the uncomplaining one, the one who carries weight quietly, but burn out invisibly, because rest was never modeled as safe, only usefulness was. Self-worth. Your value may feel conditional, based on contribution, emotional regulation, being easy. You may struggle to locate worth that isn't earned. Boundaries. You may intellectualize instead of assert, disappear instead of confront, overgive instead of negotiate, because boundaries once threatened connection. Emotional regulation. You may feel numb but functional, calm in crisis, confused in peace, because your nervous system learned to organize around absence, not presence. Internal identity. And perhaps most complicated, even your internal identity feels strangely hollow, not empty, but undefined, because no one ever stayed inside your emotional world to help you recognize it. Here is the reframe. These are not flaws, these are adaptations, evidence of intelligence, sensitivity, relational instinct. But adaptations outlive their environments, and what protected the child now limits the adult. Healing does not begin by fixing these patterns. It begins by witnessing them without self-gaslighting, by learning to say, "This makes sense. My nervous system learned this. I am not wrong. I am patterned." Awareness is not insight. It is the beginning of choice. Healing silent neglect is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is relational, slow, and deeply internal. It begins with inner child reparenting, learning to offer yourself what was absent, consistent emotional presence, permission to need, safety in expression. This means practicing micro acts of attunement. What am I feeling right now? What does my body need? What am I avoiding acknowledging? It involves shadow work, meeting the parts of you that learn to disappear, the parts that resent, the parts that ache, the parts that learn to go quiet to survive. Not to exile them, but to welcome them back into wholeness.